Hello, AP Environmental Science. This unit is about land, public and private, the land use concepts and how we classify them, and land management practices. We said before that national parks are managed for scientific, educational, aesthetic, and recreational use. And we've already noted that many of them have been established to preserve some sort of scenic view or unusual landform. But today, national parks are managed for, a variety of other reasons. And since Yellowstone National Park was founded in 1872, 57 additional national parks have been established in the United States. And so today, the National Park System manages a total of 400 national parks and other areas. And these are also historical parks and national monuments. And so with each passing year, our list continues to grow. The goal of national park management is to essentially, protect the forest, but its base is multiple use and multiple principle. So, unlike the national forest, the U.S. Parks Service sets aside specific areas to protect as an ecosystem. And in establishing Yellowstone National Park, Congress mandated that the Department of the Interior regulate the park in a manner that is consistent with preservation of timber, preservation of resources, mineral resources, and what they called back then, natural curiosities. It did not require a management process based on ecological or scientific studies. So essentially, we started protecting national parks based on their historical significance, and historians started this process. It wasn't biologists originally. National wildlife refuges are common in the federal public lands managed for the primary purpose of protecting wildlife. The Fish and Wildlife Service managers manage more than 450 national wildlife refuges and 28 waterfowl protection areas. That's about 34.4 billion hectares or 85 million acres. And this is publicly owned land that is protected for the sake of the wildlife that lives there. So, national wildlife areas are set aside with the intent of preserving large tracts of intact ecosystem and landscapes. Sometimes only a portion of the ecosystem is included in this. Wilderness areas are created from other public lands, usually a national forest or a rangeland, and they're managed by some federal agency. And so the priority of getting the proper borders designated is really depending upon how the government purchased it in the first place. These areas allow only a limited amount of humans to visit them, and they are designated oftentimes as roadless. Although logging, road building, and mining are still banned in national wilderness areas, roads that existed before the original purchase are still allowed to maintain their use. And activities like mining or previously permitted, deforestation or some other type of situation that was happening there, they're still allowed to carry those on. So if it was happening before they were acquired by the government, they can still do it. So more than 83.5 billion hectares or 95 million acres are in this federal land classification. And about 60% of all of that is in Alaska. All right, now the non-fun part. Government regulations and laws. So government regulation can influence the use of private as well as public lands. In 1969, National Environmental Policy Act, what we call NEPA, N-E-P-A, mandates an environmental assessment of all projects involving federal money and federal permits. Along with any other major laws like the 1960s and 1970s Clean Water Acts, the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act, NEPA creates an environmental regulatory system and process that is designed to ensure the protection of our nature's. It's designed to ensure the protection of the nation's resources. All right, NEPA. So before any project can begin, NEPA rules require the project's developers to file what's called an environmental impact statement. An EIS typically outlines the scope and purpose of their project. In this scope, it also provides environmental context that might suggest alternative approaches to the project and analyze the environmental impact of each alternative. NEPA does not require that developers proceed in a way that will have like the least environmental impact, but they do in some situations. The rules will stipulate that the building permits and the government funding be withheld until an environmental mitigation plan can be addressed. So essentially, if the government doesn't like your environmental impact statement, they can put a plan in place that will ensure that the developer will address such issues. Unfortunately, to some developers, creating this environmental impact statement sometimes uncovers the presence of endangered species in the areas in which they want to develop. And when this occurs, managers must apply the protective measures. So we call that the Endangered Species Act of 1973. This was a law designed to protect species from extinction. Members of the public are entitled to environmental assessment of areas where developers want to come in and build. And the decisions require government litigation and response. And although developers are not obligated to act in accordance with the public's actual wishes, in practice, the public often becomes concerned, and when they become involved, they improve the overall outcomes of the project. So for this reason, attending informational sessions and providing inputs in a good way as a concerned citizen oftentimes lead to local land use, better decisions from developers that impact the environment and in the land. But this is just an example of a series of 4 laws that, when working together, promote communities to become involved, protect the species in the land, but they don't necessarily inhibit developers from coming in and building. Before we get into the residential land use, I just want to sum up the actual land use itself. And that is that we've learned a lot in the populations unit and section about this S-curve and where we reach growing capacity, carrying capacity. But here's where we see our exponential growth. And so this X marks the spot is the ideal area where we want to hunt, harvest, clear cut, grow in population size. It's almost like when we're talking about resources or human development, which is what we're about to talk about, we're trying to find this X area. Roughly a century ago, large numbers of people in the U.S. began to move from rural areas to large cities. And within the last 50 years, we've seen this increase in movement from those cities to the surrounding areas, which has resulted in 2 classes of communities, suburban and exurban. Suburban areas surrounding metropolitan centers, and they have a low population densities compared to urban areas. Exurban areas are similar to suburban areas, but they're not as connected to any central city or densely populated area. Since 1950, more than 90% of the population growth in the metropolitan areas is suburbs, and 2 out of every 3 people now live in suburban or exurban communities. An exurb is an area similar to the suburb, but it's not connected to like a centralized city. The U.S. Census Bureau currently categorizes population of urban areas into 2,500 people. So this figure shows that the U.S. urban and rural populations between 1910 and 2012. The rural population in the U.S. has been roughly the same since 1910. And a century later, it makes up less than a fifth of the U.S. total population. Although this population shift has brought with it some new environmental problems associated, urban sprawl, it is still attempts to find creative solutions to its problems, and it's become increasingly successful.